tell you a story called The Goat in the Garden. It was Johnny's job to watch the family goats. He would milk them every morning and then walk them up the hillside so they could eat the grass all day long. At the end of the day, he would then bring them back down the hillside, milk them, and go back to bed. But one day, he left the garden gate open to his grandmother's garden, and the goats got in. "This will not do," said Johnny. He grabbed up a stick, he chased the goats around the garden, but the goats would not stop. When Johnny stopped, the goats began to eat the garden vegetables again. He sat down and began to cry. Just as Johnny sat down, a fox came along. "Why are you crying?" asked the fox. "There's goats in my grandmother's garden and I can't get them out." "Let me take care of it." So the fox went into the garden, got the stick, chased the goats around and around the garden, but the goats would not stop, just as they did for Johnny. When the fox stopped, the goats began to eat the garden vegetables again. The fox started to cry. As he sat down next to Johnny and began to cry, a dog came along. "Why are you crying?" asked the dog. "I'm crying because Johnny is crying, and Johnny is crying because there's ghosts in his grandmother's garden and we cannot get them out." "Let me take care of that." So the dog went into the garden, got the stick, and chased the goats around and around and around. The goats would still not stop. As soon as the dog stopped, the goats began to eat grandmother's vegetables again, and the dog began to cry. The dog went and sat down next to Johnny and the fox, and as he was crying, a little rabbit came down the road. "Why are you all crying?" asked the rabbit. "We are crying because Johnny is crying, and Johnny is crying because we cannot get the goats out of the garden," said the dog. "Let me take care of that." So the rabbit hopped out in the garden, got the stick again, and chased them around and around the garden. But just as the fox, Johnny, and dog could not get the goats to stop, neither could the rabbit. As soon as the rabbit stopped moving, the goats began to eat the vegetables again, and the rabbit began to cry. As all four of them were sitting on the road, a tiny little bee came along. "Why are you all crying?" said the bee. "We are crying because we cannot get the goats out of the garden." "I can take care of that." "I don't think that you can," said the rabbit. "If I, the fox, the dog, and Johnny, all much bigger than you, cannot get these goats out of the garden, I do not think that you can." "Just watch me," said the bee. So this tiny little bee flew into the garden and flew into the first and the biggest goat's ear. The goat shook his head, trying to get the bee out of his ear, and he could not do it. Finally, the bee flew out of his ear and into the next ear, and the goat ran out of the garden, leaving the bee behind. The bee did the same thing to the second and the third goat, and all three of them ran out of the garden. As soon as all three of them were out of the garden, Johnny locked up the gate and ran up the hillside back to his goats and back